Thanks for the download. If you enjoy what I'm doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever platform you're listening on, as this is the best way of bringing it to new listeners. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production costs to the minimum. My guest today, Jack Bowsher, author of Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945, the greatest combined arms manoeuvre battle of World War II. Jack argues this battle was a pivotal Allied victory, predicting modern combined arms manoeuvre warfare, including tank and air support, in an unexpected jungle and dry plains environment. He highlights Slim's strategic brilliance in adapting to the terrain and Japanese tactics, emphasising the transformation of the British and Indian armies into a highly effective fighting force capable of aggressive, deep operations behind enemy lines. The discussion also touched on the diverse composition and significant contributions of the Indian African soldiers in the campaign, and why this crucial chapter of the war has been largely forgotten in Western narratives. Let's crack on. Jack, thanks for coming on the podcast. And in your book, you make the case for the campaign's significance as a pivotal Allied victory that is often overlooked, describing Meiktila as the greatest combat arms manoeuvre battle of the Second World War. Can you elaborate on why you believe this battle stands out as one of the greatest military campaigns in history and should be included in the mainstream of Second World War victories?
Yeah, of course, Colin, and thank you so much for having me on as well. The basic idea behind the book is that, yeah, exactly, we have lost this from the mainstream. If it was ever there, it probably was never there. It's called the Forgotten War and so on for a very good reason. But it's the way that it takes all of the elements of modern manoeuvre warfare and also sort of the 3D battlefield on a logistical sense as well as a sort of an air support sense. It takes all of these things that we take for granted in modern warfare, but it puts them up in this environment where we never ever expect it to happen. No one ever thinks of the Burma campaign as being somewhere where modern combined arms manoeuvre warfare ever takes place. The classic thing that people think about is, Burma's just monsoon and jungle. And whilst there are significant battles and patrol-sized action, the Chindits, those battles are all often taking place in these things. What we need to remember is that really, for Slim, the jungle and fighting in the jungle is a means to an end. The classic examples would be when he fights the Battle of Imphal in 1944, he withdraws from the jungle-clad mountains of the boundary between India and Burma, withdraws onto a plain where, as in a geographical plain, the central plain in the middle of the mountains, at Imphal, and he fights a big battle there where he's using his ability to move around, almost like sending his reinforcements to threaten sectors on interior lines. He's doing this in this battle because those are where his advantages lie. And he then does the same thing in Meiktila, but in an offensive fashion, because the important thing about this battle is, that the book Thunder Run is all about is this battle on the central plain of Meiktila to try and destroy the Japanese army so that you can then liberate the rest of Burma following that.
So just a couple of things I just want to sort of pick apart. Firstly, for a layperson, they often think of the jungle as you can't see more than 2 feet in front of you. It's close confines, it's mountainous. But not all jungle's like that, is it?
Yeah, effectively. What you have is the sort of the scrublands, and again, if any listeners have ever had the opportunity to go to places like Imphal and Kohima, the jungle is not like if you imagine the film Platoon or something like that. It's not these dripping, enclosed monsoony jungles and that sort of thing, where Slim elects to fight a number of his battles. Like I said earlier, the fighting in the jungles is a means to an end to get to places where his advantages can be played out. So the scrubby sort of jungle that he can get tanks across, but also literally like desert plains, the middle of Burma where Meiktila is sometimes described by soldiers as a desert Salisbury plain. And so Slim understands he has all of these different advantages and he's going to use them in geographical locations that that allow him to exploit those advantages to the full. It's worth saying earlier in the war, where the, sort of the thicker jungle that we imagine in sort of southern Burma, the border with Burma and India, for example, it's interesting actually, like just thinking, if you were to be looking at a map of Burma, what you kind of have is all of the peripheries, all of the border areas, including the coastlines, are pretty much thick jungle, and often it's mountainous. But then you have, and most of the southern half of Burma as well is jungle. However, you do have this important central dry belt in the middle, either side of the Irrawaddy. And again, it's just Slim is all about trying to engineer his opportunities to fight the Japanese on those terms where the geography is on his side. Because in 1942, when the Japanese invade Burma, they use the thick jungle as a way to get around and behind British and Indian Gurkha units, outflank them because they are tied to the roads. And obviously in thick jungle, that means you're tied to something that may only be a dozen meters across. Whereas the Japanese have oceans of jungle with which to infiltrate wherever they need to. And so all of the jungle fighting, Slim has to prepare his army for jungle fighting, but it's all about creating opportunities where instead of having platoon, company-sized battles in thick jungle, like you say, where you can't see very far, and engineering those opportunities to fight battalion, brigade, divisional, and eventually corps and army-sized battles, which really is what he wants to do by 1945.
Slim very much changed the mindset of the British Army, didn't they? Up until he came on board, they'd been used to being defeated. A lot of the time, they didn't have the confidence to fight in the jungle, and he bred that confidence. So it was also him that bred that ethos of a combined arms manoeuvre warfare, and obviously he's choosing the ground to take the Japanese on, but he's also got tank warfare in the back of his mind at that point as well, do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, so going right back to the Japanese initial invasion, they used tanks in 1942. This is the British and Indian Army, British Army specifically for the tank unit. It's a British Army unit that is brought over last minute. The 7th Armoured Brigade, the Jungle Rats. And what they do is they act as like his little firefighting service. They're battle hardened. They'd fought through the early North African campaign. They are used as this fire service for striking back at Japanese incursions, allowing other units to break contact. And it's why the British and Indian soldiers get out of Burma. Intact's the wrong word, but they're cohesive. They take huge amount of casualties, and a lot of men are left behind, dead, wounded, captured, and so on. But the men that do come out are cohesive units. And a lot of that is down to the role of tanks in sort of holding off the Japanese long enough for infantry to break contact. Slim has seen that, and whilst he's not in charge in the first Arakan, which is a huge debacle, there is one small tank operation which doesn't go particularly well. But it's not enough to sort of break the confidence that actually tanks can do a good job that have been seen in 1942. And if anything, they use it to prove the point that in 1943 they try these Valentine tanks that just aren't the right tank. They don't have a big enough crew. The weaponry is wrong, that sort of thing. And so the argument that Slim makes, because after the Arakan operation in 1943 that goes wrong, he eventually gets control of 14th Army. Slim is able to persuade his commander Mountbatten, but also back in London and so on, we need medium tanks. And an element of luck here, the Sherman is beginning to come online in the Western Theatre, meaning that there are Lee tanks and Grant tanks, so the M3 medium in the American parlance, are available to be shipped. And so they arrive in Burma in modest numbers, but important ones. And so they start to equip units. Units are brought out there. Well, units are raised with British soldiers to then create these new units, the 25th Dragoons, the 3rd Carabiniers. And Slim never really looks back from that. He puts out a famous missive in what's called the Jungle Book, which is one of his sort of training things. And it's about breaking the myth of the Japanese. It's all about training and so on. But a big thing he says in this pamphlet that is shipped all across the Indian and Burmese theatre is that you can use tanks anywhere apart from swamps. And the reason why the tanks had done so well in 1942 was the Japanese don't have weapons good enough to destroy Stuart tanks. So if you bring forward medium tanks in the Lee and the Graham, the Japanese are really going to struggle to destroy those. And that's really where all of this comes from. They get used at Imphal. The Royal Engineers, the sappers are really important at getting them up mountains. Similar at Kohima, the tennis court at Kohima is eventually cleared by a Grant tank. So tanks have completely proven themselves. So by the end of Imphal and Kohima in 1944, the Japanese are on the back foot, but they're reinforcing inside Burma rapidly. Slim takes a really important decision to continue fighting through the monsoon of 1944. Previous years they would have rested out the monsoon, refitted, done some more training. And what Slim does is, because he's just about got enough men to do this, one of his divisions, the 17th Indian Division, the Black Cats, who had been fighting since the retreat in 1942, so a very experienced unit, they were rested but also mechanised so they could keep up with a tank brigade. And so what happens is, as other units, the 5th Indian Division, the 11th East African Division, they push out of Imphal at the end of 1944 and reach the Chindwin by Christmas, which is the river at the edge of the mountains, sort of the last geographical barrier before Burma from India. They reached there by Christmas of 1944, and so the 17th Indian Division, the 255th Indian Tank Brigade, along with the other tank brigades, other infantry divisions, are poised to strike into Burma itself.
Would a soldier from an armoured battle group today, if he was transported back in time to Slim's army, would he recognise combined arms manoeuvre warfare as quite similar to how we conduct it nowadays?
Yeah, so this is what's so amazing about the particular battle at Meiktila. So effectively what happens is that you take all of those same ideas that you have in any sort of normal battle group. So in this case, it's a division of mechanised infantry and a slightly weakened tank brigade. So there are normally 3 tank regiments in a tank brigade. There will now only be 2. So one of them is left behind at the Irrawaddy River, which maybe we can come to in a bit. And what they do is, and this is where the name of the book, Thunder Run, comes from, is they charge across the Japanese territory, in particular this dry belt of Burma. But what they're doing, and this is where the analogy about bringing a soldier from the modern day back to there will know it, is that they're using this manoeuvre to go and capture a particular place, a nodal point in the Japanese supply system at Meiktila, knowing that the Japanese will then have to capture it back to keep the rest of their army supplied and running. And then what they're doing is they use armoured columns to then destroy the Japanese as they come towards them. So almost like thinking about an armoured version of, say, forward operating bases during Afghanistan. Now, obviously, very, very different environment. What I'm talking about, the principle of you have a central place, rather than occupying territory for the sake of occupying it, you are occupying that space to then send out your patrols. In this case, they are maybe a squadron of tanks, then a battery of self-propelled guns, in this case 105mm Priest howitzers. You're bringing along mechanised infantry in universal carriers, lorries, that sort of thing. And then you go to a place where the enemy have been identified. That might be by human intelligence. One of the guys I follow in the book is a guy called Donald Maitland. He is interviewing locals that are coming and basically telling the British and Indian soldiers what's going on. He's interviewing them. Or it's armoured car patrols, or it's aerial reconnaissance. It's identifying a Japanese build-up. But before the Japanese actually concentrate and strike, and the timing is important here, because you want the Japanese to be concentrated reasonably because you want to destroy them. And then one of these sweeps, the squadron of tanks, the battalion of infantry, the battery of self-propelled howitzers, they then go and destroy that particular concentration, but then they return back to their base, sometimes 2 or 3 days later, sometimes it's all done in a single day. But it's all about these huge manoeuvres. And all the while, and this is very important, all of this takes place 80 miles behind Japanese lines. It's 3,000 vehicles, you're talking about 18,000 men, give or take, roughly. And so it's all being supplied by air. And that's another thing that brings in, I said about the 3D battlefield, modern day battlefield. Again, it's like the modern day equivalent of a Chinook coming up to its fob and dropping in the supplies and so on for the next week or so or whatever. Meiktila has an air base, the town that is captured as this. And the only thing that's important about it is it has an airfield, and all of the roads and railways go into it and then pass out of it again on the way to the front line where the Japanese are. And so by capturing that place, you have the airfield that can resupply you. Occasionally they have to rely on parachute drop because fighting gets intense on the airfield. They don't have enough men to have a single continuous perimeter around this place. Well, the Japanese rightly try to close the airfield through pressure, both artillery and infantry strikes. And they're relying on all of this aerial resupply, parachute drops, physical landing of planes and so on. And that's how they sustain themselves all the way through this. Casualties are being flown out in light aircraft, or the Dakotas themselves. It's a really, really modern battlefield and battle in general. And that's really why I've used quite a lot of modern language. Both, the title Thunder Run is a modern phrase, and the battle itself, combined arms manoeuvre warfare. What I'm trying to say there is this is a very, very modern battle, and we should know more about it on the sort of military academic level, but also just on the fact it is a really, really good story.
It's interesting as well when you explain it in those terms of how a contemporary soldier would recognise that. But I also find it interesting that not only did Slim use an ancient tactic of picking a fight with the enemy in his ground of his own choosing, he also was using Japanese weaknesses against them, and you already alluded to that. The Japanese army, the logistics chain was pretty poor. They actually relied on capturing stores, etc., from the enemy.
And it applies as well to things like armoured warfare as well. The reason why Slim is so desperate to have tanks, medium tanks in particular, is that advantage he has over them in that regard as well. That's just as important to him as anything else. He's also really quite desperate to make sure that he doesn't ever give the Japanese time to settle anywhere. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but this battle is not about territory. This is about fighting the Japanese on that plain where he has these advantages, because he has to get to Rangoon before the next monsoon. Now, this battle takes place in February to March 1945. But the monsoon will begin in the middle of May. If he's unlucky, it could be the beginning of May, end of April. And he can't have men that far away from the supply base back in India, relying on road transport through 2 mountain ranges and over 2 wide rivers. The Irrawaddy, which I mentioned earlier, that sort of dissect Burma in half. That's 3 times wider than the Rhine. This is not a small obstacle. And so when the monsoon is there, it can be as wide as 6 miles in some places, including the central area that we're talking about, because all of the low-lying ground either side of it floods. And you've got 2 mountain ranges that are sort of 4,000 feet up, give or take. And so therefore you have this concern that if we don't finish the Japanese in the central dry belt, if we don't destroy them, if the Japanese successfully retreat into the jungles of southern Burma, we will not get through that jungle in time, and we might have to retreat another 600 miles back to Imphal, and we're no better off than we were a year earlier. And so this whole battle is about destroying the Japanese in the centre of Burma, but the success at Meiktila is why they managed to get to Rangoon in just 6 more weeks.
It's become a bit of a cliche that the Burma campaign's been referred to as a forgotten war and its participants the forgotten army, but it's a cliche for good reason. But why do you think this crucial campaign has been overlooked in the broader narrative of World War II? So I'm quite puzzled why it's not as well known or even studied.
There are a number of reasons for it. It is primarily an Indian Army operation. It should be said the modern Indian Army does not forget it. And the Pakistani army as well, because interestingly, the Probin's Horse, one of the tank regiments, still exists in the Pakistani army, as does Deccan Horse in the Indian army. So these units, they have this as part of their proud tradition. It's also very interesting to say the RAF regiment also does not forget this. The RAF regiment had kind of earned their spurs here. This is the big battle that proves their value, because every morning they're the ones that go out initially to clear the Japanese when they encroach on the runway. Sometimes they need to call in help because the Japanese have brought so much onto the airfield in the night before. There is the forgotten war cliche, which basically comes down to the fact that most British people experience the war in the West. About 100,000 British soldiers go to Burma out of the millions who fight. So just the living memory that then gets to come home to the British, because I'm talking about the British story of the Second World War here. So therefore it doesn't come home with them. In India as well, post-partition India is not the best environment if you're outside of the military. You kind of need to learn these lessons as part of a normal professional army needs to, and the continuity post-war between regiments and so on. But outside of there, post-partition India is not the place to be remembering these great battles that liberated or in some respects reconquered Burma. You then also have the fact that at the end of the day, and this is quite a big one I think, is Meiktila is supposed to look like a feint, and so there is a lot less propaganda around it, especially at the beginning of the operation. And that then also feeds into the fact that it takes place just as the British are invading. So the crossing of the Rhine takes place in the middle of this battle. And by the time they reach Rangoon, it's VE Day. So that's also not news back home. So you don't really have the same celebration over it because there's not much to celebrate, because everyone's assuming that Britain and India will be part of the invasion force of Japan, and it's not the end of the war as far as they're concerned when May comes around. And the fighting that does take place, because it's very interesting to know, the fighting in Burma actually doesn't stop till September. There are still operations, even though the Japanese have surrendered a month earlier. It's the classic thing of Japanese holdouts. And there is fighting as late as September as the final ones sort of mopped up, refusing to surrender.
Very illuminating there, the whole political, geographical explanation why it's just such a difficult subject. You highlight the transformation of the British and Indian armies from a colonial police force to a modern fighting unit. How does Slim lead this transformation and prepare his forces to effectively counter the Imperial Japanese Army after the earlier setbacks we talked about in 1942 and 43?
The biggest one by far is the fact that he reorganises the army to not consider itself surrounded if the Japanese infiltrate around you. The classic Japanese tactic in 1942, like we said, is that infiltration. So what Slim's idea is that soldiers need to consider the enemy surrounded if they've infiltrated behind you, because, you know, you're in front of them and you've got friendly forces the other side of them. An important component, though, and again, one we've sort of mentioned, is he has to be able to rely on air power. And in 1942, they don't have the air power to contest the skies or safely do supply operations. So it wasn't really a possibility then. There are some experiments towards the end of 1942. You know, some people credit the Chindits as inventing this, but in fairness, actually the British are dropping supplies to refugees in northern India as early as August 1942, parachuting supplies. And that's basically scaled up from when Slim takes over in 1943. And again, they've seen the failures in 1943 Arakan that we talked about. One of the problems with the Arakan thing I didn't mention earlier was the Japanese knew exactly what the British were up to because they were building a massive all-weather road behind them. So, of course, what was coming was the main thrust. And so it was really easy for them to set up defensives. And it was a very narrow piece of land, Arakan. It's the coast, and it's got a severe mountain range that sort of the Arakan Yomas Mountains that sort of wedges them in against the sea. And so it was really, really obvious what was coming, and so they defend it. And Slim knows that logistical issue, if you can use air supply, you don't telegraph your intentions by building like big all-weather roads. They can wait till after the main operation that captures a piece of territory. By chance, it happens that Slim goes through all the training because the men need to be able to cope in the jungle better. The jungle is your friend. It concealed the enemy. Well, yes, it also concealed you. And so you need to use that to your advantages as well. And so it's all about learning how to survive in the jungle, live in the jungle, not even necessarily fight in the early days, just learn how to survive in the jungle and then do the training on top of that. So soldiers go through a lot of jungle training. You know, in 1942, soldiers were going to the front, having barely started their training, for desert warfare in North Africa. Now, they were supposed to be Indian replacements going to North Africa, and they were thrust into the front line in the jungles of southern Burma in sort of January 1942. Those soldiers need to be completely changed in mindset and replacements and the expanding Indian army and so on. And there are other sort of more complicated problems with the expansion of the Indian army. But The training is completely turned around by Slim to make the jungle your friend. And all of those things culminate really at Imphal and Kohima, where if the British and Indian units hold fast and get resupplied by air, as you dig in and hold firm, the Japanese will get weaker and weaker. They will be a wasting asset as they throw themselves against the defences. And so they offer themselves up for the slaughter, to put it crudely, in a way that in 1942, the British and Indian troops, the moment they were surrounded, they were like, oh, we've got to protect our supply line, we'll retreat. And they march headlong into Japanese roadblocks that ambush them, that they then have to break through to then rescue themselves. By the end of 1943, early 1944, none of that's an issue because you hold fast, aerial resupply, jungle's your friend, aggressive patrolling, and let the Japanese come to you in human wave attacks, to put it simply.
Not just was it the training and the building of the confidence in the jungle, but Slim also did a huge amount of work on and mundane, in inverted commas, things like eradicating malaria within his army the best he could, because they had a huge amount of sickness due to malaria. And also, I think of him correctly as well, making culturally appropriate rations available to the troops so that they were fed properly.
All of those things are absolutely true. And I sometimes have likened with people that Slim's way that he treats malaria is like how trench foot is treated in the First World War once you've come up with proper treatment for it. In that, if you catch malaria by later in the war, maybe not quite as harsh as the First World War, but there's an element of poor discipline. And the thing about rations for Indian Army actually is much, much older. That actually goes back to things like the Indian Mutiny. But then again, there are Indian soldiers that did say when they were cut off, actually, the necessity of the time was a personal decision. And so some people did break their normal religious practices. But there were huge efforts made to make sure that the different ration scales were dropped to the right units as best they could. But it would be secondary to other factors.
Slim's strategic objective then was to destroy the Japanese Burma area army, not merely retake territory. Operation Capital was the initial invasion of Burma, so why suddenly did it have to change to a different operation, Extended Capital?
So it's a great question. They're two distinct operations, but it shows just how brilliant Slim is at adapting situations. So Operation Capital is, as you say, the invasion of Burma. And the initial intention was for 4 Corps to charge across the sort of the northern part of the dry belt, the one that's cut in half by the Irrawaddy, and charge straight for Mandalay. Now, Mandalay is the most famous place in Burma, probably more famous than Rangoon, but they're the two places most people would have heard of. What basically happens there is, as they cross the Chindwin into northern Burma, Slim is assuming the Japanese will fight tooth and nail for every single inch of territory. And this is very, very important to the story here. That is why Slim thought by crossing over the Chindwin into the northern part of the dry plain, he would be able to destroy Kimura, as you mentioned earlier. This is not about territory. This is about destroying the Japanese Burma area army. But the Burma Area Army has now come under new leadership. The failure of Imphal and Kohima the year before has meant that a new guy, General Hotaru Kimura, has come across. Now, he has been part of the war cabinet in Tokyo. He's also very, very well travelled in Europe. So in the interwar period, he travelled, he worked with the Weimar army, he'd been to Britain, and he understood a Western way of war in a way that many of his predecessors didn't. And his subordinates didn't as well. So when he sees, or when he takes control and Slim has crossed over, Kimura does the correct thing, and we alluded to this earlier. He retreats behind the Irrawaddy River because it's massive. It's an obvious defensive advantage. So as Slim has crossed over into the northern part of that central plain, he's charging a division straight for Mandalay. They realise it's just too easy, and they are not destroying the Japanese in the numbers they hope. There's holdouts and delaying units and things like that, but they are not destroying divisions here, which is what they want. And they're now going to have to contemplate another operation to cross the Irrawaddy, which, as we said, is one of the most formidable crossings that you ever have to make in the monsoon. It's 6 miles. It's normally in the central dry belt. It's normally at the dry season when this is taking place, sort of January and into February of 1945. It's maybe about 1 mile to 2 miles, again, depending where you're crossing. And so Slim is like, this is a horrific operation. He does not have the scale of equipment that is available in the West. He does not have LVTs, those Buffalo tracked vehicles that are amphibious. He doesn't have LCVPs being trucked on Diamond T transporters across the territory. And also, at the end of the day, by the time he's at the Irrawaddy, he's 600 miles and one river and two mountain ranges back to the railhead at Dimapur. I mean, it's even further to Calcutta, the equivalent to Antwerp, say, in Europe, to the Rhine. Antwerp to the Rhine is about 100 miles on European roads, mostly flat because it's northern, it's Netherlands into northern Germany. Like I said, this is two mountain ranges, a river that's similar to the Rhine on the Chindwin, and then it's a much wider river to cross. And they're making the craft they need out of Bailey Bridge sections built on pontoons for tanks. They're making their own flimsy, collapsible canvas boats, and then they truck them to the Irrawaddy mostly. Just incredible. And again, remember, he is doing this completely on the fly. He was expecting to destroy the Japanese on the northern side of the plain because they would fight tooth and nail. But Kimura doesn't do it because he's not a normal Japanese general. He's had that education in the West, or he's had that experience of the West. So Slim realises, if I'm going to make this crossing work, I need to draw the Japanese into two different things. Because if he does get across the Irrawaddy successfully, what if Kimura retreats again? He causes loads of casualties. It's a bloody crossing, but we get across. And then he's able to retreat at his own choosing into the jungles of southern Burma. He doesn't want that. And the mountain range that divides southern Burma in two. He does not want to fight a tooth and nail battle through those jungles and the mountains and so on of southern Burma. And so he needs to make sure he traps the Japanese on the central plain. So the first thing he does is he wants the Japanese, Kimura, to believe business as usual, that Slim is going to cross at Mandalay, capture Mandalay. And so he stages a series of crossings to capture Mandalay. But he's going to time those with another operation. So at the beginning, I said that it was 4th Corps charging across the northern dry belt to Mandalay. This is where it gets really clever. Only one division of 4 Corps had actually crossed. It's a huge deception plan. So 4 Corps had already entered the northern part of the plain. What he's going to do is he's going to keep that division of 4 Corps, 19th Indian Division. He's going to keep them going for Mandalay. So it will look like business as usual. But the rest of 4 Corps are going to be sent down another valley called the Gangor Valley, which is a malarial, mountains, jungles, and that sort of thing. And they're going to go further south and 100 miles to the west as well. And then another corps, 33rd Corps, will join the 19th Indian Division on that northern place at Mandalay. They will capture Mandalay. And that's going to be big and noisy and obvious. The Japanese, Kimura, he will send reinforcements to Mandalay. This other 4 Corps who is going down the Gangor Valley are going to suddenly pop out 90 miles to the southwest. They're going to jump the Irrawaddy, and the Japanese will have sent all of their reinforcements to Mandalay, and then they're going to drive across the southern part of the dry belt, trapping Kimura and most of his army, not all of it, but most of it, up at Mandalay. So they can't retreat back into the jungles. And this is where Meiktila, this town, the whole point of the book, Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945, is if you take Meiktila, because of all those supply things we talked about earlier, Kimura will then have to attack Meiktila itself. And so then what you have is February 1945, 33rd Corps cross at Mandalay, then 4 Corps begin crossing 80 miles southwest at a place called Nyonggu. And they kind of time the crossings so that there's a crossing at Mandalay, then a crossing at Nyonggu, further south, then 2 more crossings back at Mandalay. And that is hopefully going to look like the crossing in the southwest at Nyonggu. That's going to look like a feint. But actually, it's the Mandalay ones that's the feint. And this is the beauty of this operation. So when Slim sends his Thunder Run, and again, that's a word I use, this goes back to the fact that when I wrote my first book, Forgotten Armour, about tank warfare in Burma, I was doing a master's in military history, and I was doing the reading for a thesis that became the first book. We were studying the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and it was the February where Putin attempted to charge to Kyiv from Belarus. And I likened it to the 2003 Thunder Run, and then I read about this battle as well. And so the three things joined the dots, and that's kind of where the title for the book came from. And what he does is he sends his 255th Indian Tank Brigade, 17th Indian Division, to basically seal the Japanese at the northern end at Mandalay, and then Kimura would have to strike back. That gives Slim his battle on the plain where the Japanese will offer themselves up for destruction. The deception itself is incredibly brilliant, but it's just such an elegant solution to, I need to cross this river obstacle, and I need to trap the Japanese, and I need to destroy them on ground of my own choosing, when they have the option to break the contact to their own territory whenever they like. It's brilliant. Just brilliant.
I think it's quite extraordinary. You're talking about quite casually, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but casually manoeuvring divisions and corps through that environment, because you normally associate those sort of broad sweeping movements with the plains of northwestern Europe, not the jungle environment of Burma.
Yeah. I mean, that is the incredible thing, because both of these two corps have come over hundreds of miles of freshly made road, because that's the other thing we haven't really mentioned. Most of these roads are being built. That feint down the Gangor Valley, that is virgin jungle. And they are cutting, the Royal Engineers are cutting a brand new road down through that. In the book, I do follow a sapper who is in charge of a mechanical equipment platoon, basically bulldozers. And they go on the Thunder Run to also build and maintain the airfields. But they're building the roads with them. They're helping to build the road through that valley. You don't have this in the European context, and they don't have the same equipment. And there are good reasons for that. I get it. Germany is more technologically advanced. It's closer to home, close to America and so on. There are good reasons for the differences. But again, it's just that thing. We so casually say, lots of people will say that Slim is the greatest ever commander. And I think some people, not a lot of people don't, but some people I think of Imphal and Kohima, which are amazing, impressive battles. They think of Slim turning around the Indian army, in particular in Burma. But this is the real one. This should be Slim's legacy. And again, to people that really know the Burma campaign, they know that it's the 1945 operations that really are the one that makes Slim such an amazing commander. And again, that goes back to the point of the book is I want to make that the mainstream answer to the question, why is Slim such an amazing commander?
But it's not a simple plan either. Some plans are brilliant in their simplicity. This plan is brilliant in its complexity and the environment and the climate and everything else. And there's so much that could have went wrong. So again, it just shows you the level of training that the guys must have had, because a lot of the time they would have to have made decisions on the hoof to fulfill Slim's intent. But can you just go over its core concept, the key units involved, and how they achieved this audacious dash 80 miles deep behind enemy lines?
Yeah, so what they do is, once the Irrawaddy has been crossed by another amazing operation by the 7th Indian Division, they're the ones that affect the crossing. But they very quickly start rushing the 17th Indian Division, the Black Cats, and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. Some people listening to this, if they're into the Burma campaign, or if they're just into the Second World War, will probably have heard of George MacDonald Fraser's Quarter Safe Out Here. He writes, amazing book, really strongly recommend. He's in the 17th Indian Division. He's the 9th Border Regiment. So there's a number of British units. There's a couple of Gurkha regiments. There's the 1st and 10th and the 1st and 7th. There's the 7th and 10th Baluch regiment. They're all these romantic Indian Army units. And the other really crucial ones, though, are the tank regiments. So you have the 5th Probyn's Horse and the 9th Deccan Horse, Royal Deccan Horse. And the thing about the 17th Indian Division, they've been like a phoenix rising from, the ashes. So in 1942, they really take a hammering. For those that know the Burma campaign, 2/3 of them were on the wrong side of a bridge when their own commander blew it, the Sitang Bridge disaster. So 5,000 men on the wrong side of the bridge. A lot of them don't make it back. Some do, but a lot don't. They then fight really commendably in the situation, in the circumstances, through the rest of that retreat. They then are refitted over 1943 and eventually will then take part in the defence of Imphal and fight a very, very close run but important retreat back to the Imphal plain. They're nearly cut off. Because Slim slightly gets the time wrong, he admits himself he nearly got it wrong and nearly lost that division. And the big man under this is Punch Cowan. Now, Punch Cowan, he was the guy that replaced the previous commander who blew up the bridge that cut off 2/3 of his men. Slim had criticised him at Imphal for using headlong attacks, almost First World War-ish, the cliche of a First World War commander. But Cowan is an incredibly aggressive commander who learns those lessons. He takes those things on board. And so when it comes to this, even though his men have been through so much, like I said, they really are a phoenix from the flames type thing here, because of what they've come through from 1942 through 1944. They're now selected to do this job because they're dependable, reliable, aggressive unit, very well trained, very experienced. They know the Japanese. And with inexperienced tank units, and that's important. The 255th Tank Unit have just been equipped with Shermans and could potentially have gone forward in the Imphal battle, but it's more difficult logistics. It's touch and go for a lot of the battle, and Slim is basically confident that the units he has in place will do the job adequately, and he is then proven right. One of the big things at Meiktila that is very marked is the increase in desperate suicide attacks. In my first book, I talk about near Mandalay, in a Grant tank, a Japanese soldier actually climbs up onto a tank and actually kills the tank commander with a samurai sword, climbs inside the tank, kills the gunner, and then it's the loader that finally kills him. They have a hand-to-hand fight inside a turret. So when the 255th Indian Tank Brigade, they charge out of the Irrawaddy bridgehead, one of the things that they come across is a village called Oyin that has got a couple of companies of the Japanese. And when the Progan's Horse, the tank regiment, go in with the infantry, they realise that the Japanese suicide tactics have gone up a notch from what they'd been trained on. And so what they now find is that Japanese soldiers are just charging out from bushes and jumping underneath and blowing themselves up, which was less common at, say, Imphal. There was similar stuff, and there were also things like pole charges and so on. But this is the first time they've had people literally jumping under it. It's an infantry version of kamikaze fighters, isn't it? One of them talks about at this particular battle at Oyin, that kind of he jumped out so suddenly that the infantry kind of didn't quite react. And the guy with his little box of explosives, they called picric acid, one of the witnesses described him as like a rugby player barging through the line, the way he's clutching the box like a rugby ball and swerving with his shoulders and so on. And as he charges up to the tank and blows himself up, and tank crew are killed, tank crew are wounded, infantry are killed and wounded. Most of them are killed the moment they break cover, but some do get through. And then when they get to Meiktila, there's more of this. But there's also things like they find that the Japanese have dug pits in the roads, and they come up to them and they see them. And when the infantry approach them, they find that there are Japanese soldiers with aerial bombs, because there's an airfield nearby and Meiktila, remember, is a supply hub. What they've done is they've put with no planes left, they've put aerial bombs in these pits. And then a Japanese infantryman is there with a brick or a hammer or something like that to just bang the detonator the moment that a tank rumbles over. And 99 times out of 100, this doesn't work because the holes are really obvious. The tanks don't go near them. And one of them talks about how they found a guy in the bottom of one, and he just sort of looks up at them a little bit pathetically, but doesn't take the opportunity to kill the 3 British soldiers because he was told to wait for a tank. So he just looks at them. They all freeze for a moment, and then one of them just realises he's not going to do anything, so they shoot him. And it shows you the mindset of the Japanese soldier here. And that comes down to sort of the whole Bushido thing. The men are supposed to unswervingly serve the emperor, and that loyalty is then transferred down through the mouth of every single officer that gives them an order. And so therefore not doing that is effectively a form of shame. Unlike, say, in a citizen army that the British Army full of conscripts and some volunteers by this point. It's 1945, many of them are going to be conscripts. There is a different social contract there, I think. And that really makes a difference, I think. A British soldier and an Indian soldier, they are flexible in a way that the Japanese soldiers aren't.
How was the British morale at this point, though? And so when I say British, I'm obviously referring to the Indian troops as well. And so was morale high at this point?
Yeah, morale absolutely is. There is an amazing quote by the commander of 5th Province Horse, and I would strongly recommend, apart from obviously buying my books, but if you can find a copy of A Change of Jungles by a man called Miles Smeaton, it is one of the best memoirs of the Second World War I've ever read, and he commands Province Horse at Meiktila, the only major operation they take part in. Now, he's a brilliant example of this, because what he says about the Japanese is just the way that their morale is so good, their training has been so good, the fact that even though there are these Japanese suicide attacks, it doesn't change them. So this is the quote: "Their anguished look of determination and despair," he's referring to suicide people running at him, "their anguished look of determination and despair, pitting their puny strength against such tremendous force," obviously referring to his tanks. "This desperate form of courage was something that we knew little of and saw with amazement, admiration, and pity." Now, it's an incredible quote, because if you think back 2-3 years earlier, it's the Japanese Superman myth. We can't defeat the Japanese, and soldiers talk about how terrifying it was. Yet by 1945, there's nothing like success to improve morale, even with Japanese desperation. They have gone from soldiers fearing the Japanese to pitying them because of this. So it's an interesting thing there. And so morale is actually pretty high amongst both Indian and British soldiers who are out there. These men can be 80 miles behind Japanese lines, surrounded, and yet they fight an incredibly professional battle and take relatively few casualties, and then go on, along with other units once they catch up, to then capture Rangoon.
It's an amazing transformation. Can you talk us through the initial assault on Meiktila itself? What the Japanese defences are like, the actual fighting in Meiktila as well, because at this point, not only you've got tanks involved, you've got street-to-street combat as well. So you just give us a feel for that, how that battle evolved and the intensity of it.
Yeah, of course. So the feint by Four-Corps down the Gangor Valley works perfectly. And again, the details of that we don't really have time for here, but if people want to read it, I do cover from the end of Imphal up to Rangoon, so almost a year of fighting. But basically what happens is when they strike out from the Irrawaddy, the Japanese still think it's a feint. It's really only when the Thunder Run captures an airfield about 5-10 miles outside of Meiktila that the Japanese realise quite how bad it is, but it's too late. As that's happening, the Japanese commander at the time he's a logistician. He's not a combat soldier. Funnily enough, he had briefly been on Okinawa, but then he was detached from his division. His division was then taken to Formosa, which they all thought was a death sentence. They all thought that Formosa was the one that was going to be attacked, not Okinawa, in 1945. The guy's called Tomokichi Kasua, a major general. He then gets taken to be a logistician in Burma, thinking that, again, I'm all right now because I'm not on Formosa. His old division ends up surrendering intact because no one invades Formosa.
That was what Taiwan was known as previously, am I right? Formosa, yeah.
Taiwan now, sorry, yeah. So his old unit actually are completely unscathed. He ends up being surrounded at Meiktila. Actually, to his credit, in the situation, he actually does the best he can. He does organise a reasonable defence. And it's important about Meiktila, it is not like wooden bashers, village buildings on stilts and so on. This is a modern transit route. So it's concrete buildings, it's modern railway stations, there's a marshalling yard, there's a hospital, there are warehouses for the trade of goods, petrol facilities, oil facilities, there's the airfield itself. This is a modern European colonial town. There's logistics areas, mechanical equipment, mechanic shops, the workshops for the repair of vehicles and so on, as well as lots and lots and lots of ordnance and weapons. So they have an unusual amount of automatic weapons. One of the things that the 17th Indian Division Infantry in particular notes is that the Japanese have an unusual amount of light machine guns and medium machine guns. They have a few of those light anti-aircraft guns. They find those being used in an anti-infantry role. There's a famous battle that the Gurkhas take place when they have to take one of these out. So they are using all this stuff, and lots of these buildings have basements. And so the Japanese turn the basements of a lot of these buildings as well. They're dragging artillery inside buildings. There's at least one building that is blown sky high because of the ammunition store in the back of a building for the 2 guns they've put in the front of the building sticking out of windows. So they really do create a horrific street battle. The eyewitnesses talk about problems of brick dust getting all over their bodies, in their mouths and so on. It's 40-degree heat for them. And they're trying to fight through all the explosions causing the brick dust, and it's dusty ground anyway. 40 odd degrees, the lack of drinking water, difficulties of finding drinking water because the water supplies get wrecked, and all this sort of thing. And it's house to house, street to street. The tanks are used for bunker busting. It's not as bad as anything like Stalingrad. I'm not going to be stupid enough to try and say that it's like that, that it's as bad as that. But it is like that. The Battle of Berlin, the classic street fight that you get. It is horrific, and some really awful moments there. And eventually they do wipe out most of the garrison. Small numbers do exfiltrate, including actually Kasuya himself. He is ordered to get out.
That's unusual. That's unusual for a Japanese commander, isn't it?
Well, there is an element of the fight until you die thing is absolutely true, but there is an element also of you give your life in a worthwhile way. Kasuya was told to get out with his cadre of staff and things like that, because he still had a job to do. And literally, he does this. He loses this battle quite obviously. He is quite badly outnumbered, but he does deserve a little bit of credit because he does the best he can in the circumstances, thinking purely from a military leadership point of view and no other point of view. But then he's put straight back into logistics again, and he surrenders at the end of the war. The amazing thing is, because he survives the war, and again I use this in the book, he was interviewed by the Indian Army, and the transcript of his interrogation is in the National Archives, so I was able to use his own words to describe it. He wrote a little appreciation of the end of each day. So I break down in the book the 4 days of the battle for Meiktila. But they do eventually take it, and 2 Victoria Crosses are won as well, one by a British soldier, one by an Indian soldier during the battle as well, which is interesting as well for a fairly one-sided, if grim and bitter victory.
The British demonstrate a flexibility. They're doing these massive rush through to the built-up area of Meiktila. They're transitioning from jungle to urban warfare as well. And it's not something you'd expect for soldiers to do in that environment, is it? It's...
No, not at all. No, they do assume they would have a fight for it. And the way that they approach it is actually really similar to jungle warfare, to be honest. They use the tanks to smash the Japanese bunkers in the basements, which is what the tanks had been doing since the end of 1943, beginning of 1944 in particular. Bunker busting with a tank is kind of how they take back Japanese territory by that point. They developed that in the winter of 1943. And it's first put to good use just before the admin box, and they perfect it through the admin box in Imphal. And that's then just applied to urban warfare. So they treat it very, very similar, which is incredibly interesting. But it is short-lived. The battle that is urban only lasts for about 4 days. But the 2 Victoria Crosses, one of them is where the Japanese run out of a particular bunker, and an Indian soldier, Fazal Din, gets a samurai sword through his chest, so the tip comes out the back. He pulls it out, kills the Japanese officer that did it, and then also rescues a friend with the sword before then reporting sick and dying the next morning. And the other one, William Weston, he charges a bunker that they thought had been abandoned, but they'd actually just waited quietly until people's backs were turned. And as he closes on it, he's hit by a couple of bullets and falls at sort of the entrance. And he just takes a grenade off his webbing and rolls himself inside and kills himself, but destroying the bunker in the process.
Despite this fanaticism and fanatical resistance, from what you're saying there, I take it was tactics, sheer weight of force that enabled the British and Indian armies to prevail at Meiktila.
Yeah, it is. Persistence is actually a really important one, because a phase after the battle for Meiktila, where they've surrounded it and destroyed Kasuya and his garrison, although he escapes, that next part of those armoured sweeps that I mentioned earlier, and that's about just the fact is they have to keep going. There's a relentlessness to it, because this part of the battle now goes on for 4 weeks. And again, it's so important to not forget this. They are behind the Japanese lines for 6 weeks. A week getting to Meiktila, the four days capturing it, and then also the 4 and a bit weeks where they're having to defend themselves from the Japanese, who are now coming for them. Because remember, the whole point of the feint in the first place at Mandalay was to draw the Japanese to the north, so they'd have to come to Meiktila to clear it, and therefore offer themselves up for destruction. So it's part of Slim, Messavi, Cowan's plan. It's all part of the plan, but that doesn't make it easy. It's a very difficult, very risky operation, relying on air supply being successful for a division and a tank brigade, and they rush in extra infantry brigades as well. It actually ends up, the 17th Indian Division actually technically ends up being 4 infantry brigades by the end of the battle, because they brought an extra one in, and all of the extras that go with it, the infantry and the tanks of the army brigade and so on. And all of the point of that is the relentless nature of those sweeps. The last thing they want, considering their situation, is for the Japanese to properly muster as a cohesive unit. Now, they're helped out by the fact that the Japanese doctrine is effectively, we want to strike an enemy before they settle, when it might be prudent for them actually to organise themselves as a Clausewitzian, all of your strength in a particular weak point. It's only towards the end of the battle they do something like that. So a new commander comes in, General Masaki Honda, who had been fighting the Americans and Chinese in the north of Burma up to that point. He comes down to take over this operation because it was divided between the commander at Mandalay and the commander at Meiktila. It was treated as a single operation, which sometimes in history books they are treated as simultaneous battles, and they are. But we have to see them both in their individuals as well as their collective moment. Hence the book focusing primarily, almost exclusively on Meiktila. But Honda comes down because the Meiktila battle needs to be victorious for the Japanese, or Burma is lost. And he concentrates on the airfield, which is what they should have done from day one. And they only do it in the second half of March, by which point the Japanese have already lost a huge amount of numbers to those armoured sweeps in attritional warfare. Like I said, it's about the constant smashing of Japanese troops every time they appear. The resilient nature of the defenders keeping the initiative by going on these armoured sweeps. Because this is the thing again, they're the defenders, but they hold the initiative throughout this battle because they choose when they attack the Japanese, because they're constantly striking them before they're ready. When Honda does concentrate on the airfield, those final 2 weeks of March, these are the most stressful moments of the battle, because they do close the airfield to resupply for a few days. But the trouble is they can still get by on parachute drops. It's obviously not as good as having Dakotas landing with a normal load rather than dropping things by parachute drops. And stuff gets damaged and broken, and some of it even drifts too close to the Japanese. One of the guys talks about the problem of just praying that the next drop during this period where they're not getting proper supplies in, praying that the next drop doesn't land too close to the enemy, because they don't want to have to fight for the supplies. They want to just be able to collect it. And that problem of, if I want to get fed tomorrow, I need to make sure that that lands in the right place, or I've got to fight for it. Some of our men will die trying to get the supplies for tomorrow from today's drop. And that's why I mentioned about the RAF regiment earlier. They're the ones going out and doing a lot of the initial contact with the Japanese, and then reinforcements might arrive. They're even doing armoured sweeps on the airfield to clear the Japanese. And the Japanese sometimes bring anti-tank guns up. They use anti-tank guns to destroy Dakotas as they're lining up to take off. An aircraftman, he's a medical orderly in the body of the Dakota. He normally unloads supplies at one end, but then he's looking after the wounded that they're evacuating the other way. He drags all the guys out because an anti-tank gun has ripped through the engine. The Dakota's undercarriage has completely collapsed on that side, and they're under artillery and distant machine gun fire, and he pulls all the wounded off as the pilot and co-pilot make the engine safe so the whole thing doesn't go off in flames, and then they help with the evacuation. But most of it's done by this medical orderly, Ian Fides, and he gets a military medal for that. There are these amazing stories, and the Japanese really put a lot of pressure. This is the moment of greatest difficulty, really, those last 2 weeks of March. But it is still a victory. The Japanese are forced to break contact, not least as they bring a lot of artillery to the north of Meiktila. Almost the entirety of the 15th Army, which is a corps in the British parlance, almost the entire Japanese 15th Army's artillery is brought to Meiktila for this battle, including like 150mm howitzers, 105mm howitzers, and so on, to plaster this airfield. And eventually the attrition rate on the Japanese infantry in particular, but also the artillery, takes its toll, and they break contact. And part of the reason they break contact is also because the battle at Mandalay is over, and the 20th Indian Division in particular are now coming south. And Slim uses this metaphor that he uses a number of times. Slim has two metaphors that he loves. When units are mixed in with each other, he describes them as Neapolitan ice cream. If anyone's read Defeat into Victory, they should recognise that he uses it a number of times. And the other one is when he describes the Japanese being crushed between a hammer and an anvil. And Meiktila is the anvil and Mandalay is the hammer. And he uses that description here. And the Japanese escape, the dregs of what remains of 15th Army escape east and then head south. And the point that I made earlier was, by this point, they are the entirety of the Japanese army in northern Burma, the Burma Area Army, which is two of their armies, corps in the British parlance, they are both now trapped, but also broken. And so now you get 6 weeks of fighting over Meiktila and Mandalay further north. You now get 6 weeks and they make it to Rangoon, which is 400 miles south. And it's through thick jungle again. So there are times when the tanks are overtaking Japanese infantry and leaving them to be mopped up. They're not even bothering because the Rangoon is the objective now because they've already destroyed the Japanese army and they're demoralised. And they don't put up the same fight. Really psychologically incredible the way the Japanese react at the end of the Burma campaign.
Well, they effectively broken. The morale was crushed and that was it for them.
Yeah. I don't want to oversimplify that. I'm not saying that every single Japanese soldier didn't continue to sell their life dearly. They did. And there are a couple other sharp battles. Purebury, for example, one that George MacDonald Fraser talks about. It should be said, and I talk about this in the book, there are some members of George MacDonald Fraser's unit, same company, who say that Fraser puts himself in the action a bit too much. I mean, in fairness to Fraser as well, he also says at the beginnings that I can't completely remember absolutely everything, and in particular dialogue he says is so I don't use any, I've used Fraser as a witness, but I haven't used any dialogue because I don't trust it. Purebury in particular, that's really the last significant battle. Well over 1,000 Japanese are killed in that short battle. And again, they are surrounded and destroyed by tanks shooting south. The last couple of tank-on-tank battles are there, and again, they're completely one-sided. There aren't many tank-on-tank battles in the Burma campaign. Mostly it's tank versus infantry, tank versus anti-tank, because there just aren't many Japanese tanks there. But the last ones are at Purebury. There's no tank versus tank at Meiktila, interestingly, even though there is a couple of small tank actions. But, as early as 1942, the Japanese were desperately avoiding putting their tanks against British and American-designed tanks. They completely avoided it from early 1942 because of a bad experience there. And they send them up a different valley towards the Chinese in 1942, for example, rather than use them against 7th Armoured Brigade. So it's mostly tanks versus infantry, tanks versus anti-tank throughout all of this. And yet it's 400 miles in 6 weeks from the end of Meiktila through Purebury to Rangoon, and effectively the war in Burma is over by then. And certainly VE Day happens in that period as well, which is why it ends up being forgotten.
I mean, those rates of advance are just, for that environment, are just stunning, really. I mean, sort of rates of advance you expect in northwestern Europe in some respects, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely stunning. And what I like about your book is, as well, when we've tried to highlight the importance of the Indian Army, the Gurkhas, and there's a golden thread of that going throughout our discussion. And you've dedicated the book to the people and the men of all faiths and nationalities who fought in the campaign. In what ways does your book honour those sacrifices and ensure that the diverse stories are remembered from all the nationalities that took part?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried my hardest to include as many of the nationalities nationalities is maybe a bit far considering post-partition India. The fact that also I've got a Kenyan, so I follow a Kenyan soldier fairly closely. And the most unfortunate thing with all of this, I have done my best, and I dedicate the book completely sincerely to them. But there is an unfortunate fact that realistically it is very difficult to find a lot of these soldier stories in their own words. So a lot of them are second-hand and often through the prism of white British officers, in particular, but not always. There are some Indian eyewitnesses and so on that I use, and African as well. But it is very, very difficult, and that was the big reason why I wanted to do that, because we need to remember that this was an incredibly diverse theatre. There's another quote that I have on there. I think this one actually slightly describes it better. So this is from a guy called Howard Mitchell. Well, he's one of the guys that's flown in to Meiktila partway through the battle. He's actually in the 5th Indian Division, 9th Brigade, who are flown in to reinforce. But what he says, when he's waiting to go forwards and he sees the nature of what's around him, what he's trying, the people, the logisticians, as well as the people that are going to go forwards. So yeah, this is Harold Mitchell then. So at Manipur Railhead, men of a dozen different nationalities rubbed shoulders, where men of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Canada and America, who spoke the same tongue with many accents, mixed freely with Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, Gurkhas, Chinese and East and West Africans. The spirit of victory prevailed, the quiet confidence of an army on its way to win a war.
Yeah.
But that quote is the one for me, is that we have to remember that this campaign, the Burma campaign as a whole, not just the Meiktila one, the Burma campaign as a whole is it's an empire effort because that's the language of the time. There's a Commonwealth effort to talk about it retrospectively and with hindsight and so on. What happens to India in partition is obviously a huge tragedy that makes it more difficult maybe to celebrate some of these things. I do think that it is a real shame that the Indian National Army has been venerated in India when it's just complete nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's almost irrelevant to the campaign because it's so crap. And yet it's become part of this myth, which there might be some Indian listeners that don't want to hear that. But unfortunately, the historical record goes to that if they're prepared to go and look for it. And so we should remember, because I want men to be remembered. I grew up in Kent, but I grew up in a place with a very large Sikh population. I had a lot of Sikh friends growing up. But it is an Indian Army effort. This is a celebration of the Indian Army. In all my books and all my research, it's about that. And I don't ever want to forget that, because they're the ones that do the fighting. And their motivations are not just, the lazy thing to say is that it was money and that it was a legitimate career to an Indian person. But to be honest, they knew all about the rape of Nanking in 1937. They know what Japanese imperialism is. And at the very least, it's not perfect. And again, I'm not defending the British record particularly here. But Dominion status and then independence for India was an open question that was in debate and was in some process. There had been watered down versions, the Government of India Act, but watered down versions of democracy and so on, that are coming into effect. And so Indian soldiers don't want to replace the colonialism that's clearly on its way out to be replaced with a new kind of colonialism that has the viciousness of the Japanese. And we shouldn't forget any of that, even if perhaps it has been forgotten by some people, obviously not more learned listeners and things like that from India and so on. And I just want to celebrate that. And I want people to know that we in Britain accept that, because we should. It is a battle fought by the Indians in particular, but also those African soldiers who only make a small part of my story, because they're only really at the beginning of the book, because that's the major action that they have a huge impact on for this particular battle, but they are continuing to fight in other places. The 81st West African Division, who spend 9 months behind Japanese lines in the Arakan in 1944 to 1945. And I'm just going to do a shout out. Lucy Bettridge Dyson has an amazing book, and you should reach out to her. I don't mind connecting you actually when her book comes out next year on the Arakan 1944 to 45. And in particular, she covers the 81st West African Division. They do a much better job than the Chindits do. This is not to disparage the Chindits themselves, but they have a much bigger strategic impact because they effectively manoeuvre the Japanese out of really good defensive positions without having to fire a shot. So they deserve our respect and for us to remember them.
I think it's important that contribution, huge contribution to the war effort is acknowledged. And we did an episode on the Indian Army couple of years ago, and I got a really nice email from an Indian listener, a chap of Indian descent living in the UK, who said it was nice to hear that acknowledgement of the huge contribution of the Indian Army during the Second World War to the British victory.
Yeah, do you know, just an interesting thing on that. I mentioned this at the beginning of the book in an author's note. I didn't want this to be tedious, but when I wrote Forgotten Armour, and I talked about people who had relatives today, and some of them were people who I'd posted on a Burma research group's Facebook page, for example, where there were people they're the descendants of people that fought, saying that is there anyone that fought in tanks in the war and so on, fought with tanks and talked about it, or left memoirs unpublished and so on, letters, anything. And some of them came forward, but also then people that read my book afterwards and said, that's my relative you mentioned, because their name had come up in an after action report. And they said how moving it was. It was really nice to hear this. They said they really liked the way that I dealt with them. So I've in Meiktila, and I've put this at the beginning of the book, and I've made an even bigger effort. If someone is mentioned by name for having done a thing, even if it's relatively minor and I only mention them once, instead of the simplistic thing to do is to skip over the name of the person and just say that a thing happened, I have mentioned them by name. Even if I don't know their first name, I can't find any other information about them. Because things like Forces War Records is sometimes a good place for that. So the biggest one was, and I'm apologies to them if they're listening because I can't remember what their name was now, but their relative in a tank that was dragged by Royal Engineers up a mountain during the monsoon in June 1944, and they're driving north towards Kohima whilst the breakout from Kohima is coming the other way. So it's the Imphal Kohima road between the two, and they're up in the mountains in the monsoon. And I described the death of a particular person, fully named because he's talked about in the after action report. And the guy contacted me and he said, I knew that he died, but I now know that that's how he died. And the power of naming these individuals, even if you don't know much about them, you never know. That person might go, oh my God, my granddad of the same name was in that regiment and he died on that day. Yeah. I had no idea. Maybe that will happen with this, maybe it won't. But I realised the power of that to someone who's reading it. It really was important to me to include their names, as tedious as it might come to a more general listener who's maybe not got the emotional attachment. But I don't really apologise for that. And the book's available if people want to buy it. Chiselbury.co.uk is my actual publisher, direct from them. If you want to support me, that's the one that's most generous to me. But it is on Amazon, Waterstones, things like that.
So, Jack, we'll finish off with Desert Island Dits, which is the guest choice of book, film, and luxury item. So, what is your book choice?
So my book choice would be, I feel like the only fair thing to say after this is probably actually Slim's Defeat and Victory, because it is a real Bible for anyone that wants to know about the Burma campaign. It is obviously the leadership level, but if you're going to do the Burma campaign, there is no better place to start. Apart from obviously, because I also have a podcast, the Forgotten War podcast, and Robert Lyman's A War of Empires is a brilliant narrative. But those two, but Slim Defeat and to Victory, to have the words from the big man himself, that would be my book to take.
And your film choice?
So I mentioned this earlier, actually. It's got to be A Bridge Too Far, because my grandfather is the person that got me into history. He's my hero. I dedicated the first book to him and so on. He's the reason that I'm sat here now. I'm a history teacher. Without him, I would not. And he had a VHS that he'd recorded off the telly because it was on, and he was like, and I was old enough, and he was like, you should watch that. And we sat and watched it, and we tanned the hell out of that VHS recording. The amazing thing is, because it's obviously a long film, it cuts out as the scene towards the end where it's gone wrong at the Hartenstein. In fairness, they've already retreated across the Rhine back. Sean Connery has already retreated back. But there's the scene of the guy playing, I don't know what song it is, but he's playing the flute right at the end. And I always joke but it then cut out as he's playing the flute. I didn't know how it ended. And that maybe 30 Corps got through. But it was a formative film for me. I'd seen other war films and things like that, but that was my favourite growing up, and I watched it again and again and again, and I loved it. And he drove Sexton's self-propelled artillery in the 11th Armoured Division, although in his post-war, like 1947 to 49, he was doing his national service. But all of his NCOs, battery commanders and so on, they were all veterans of the Normandy campaign into 1945. And he used to tell me about that and sort of things. I was very lucky a couple of years ago, I got to ride in a Sexton at We Have Ways Festival, which was very emotional. I got to sit in the driver's seat and recreate a photo I have of him driving it when he was about 19. Which I treasure. That's
a great addition to your choice there, mate. And luxury item?
Luxury item. Now, I've just got back from a World War I battlefield trip for school, and I took with me a proper pillow because of the school hostel weird square pillows they always seem to have that are completely knackered and terrible. You may as well, I've actually just folded up spare duvets from a different bunk bed rather than use the actual pillow.
You're showing your age now, Jack, when a pillow is one of the most important things. But absolutely, mate, I'm a good bit older than you, and I can thoroughly identify the need for a decent pillow. Jack, thanks for coming on, mate. That's been really interesting chat, and it's fleshed out your book, which is my recommendation for this episode, because I have also neglected the Far Eastern campaigns of World War II, and I was always into the European theatre, and it's only in the last sort of 5-6 years or so that I've started really filling in those holes. So things like knowing about armoured warfare in Burma and that is incredible to me, and just hearing you describe those, I will use the word epic sweeps that you would think could never take place in that environment. It's hugely illuminating. So your book is my recommendation for my choice this week.
Well, thank you. That's exactly what. Yeah, that's exactly what I want people to take from it. So I really, really appreciate that, Colin. Thank you, and thank you so much for having me on. Amazing. I've loved it to have such a free time chatting as well.
That's it for another episode. So, as I said, thanks to Jack for coming to the podcast, and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get podcasts from. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISAR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.